But anyhow, I think we can. Okay, well, Viva just. Okay, well, when Viva comes back, I think we can get started with the interview.
Okay.
Lucy, everything good?
Yeah, I think if I turn on this light, I think it I think it does something weird. I don't know if it's like flashing with you
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
doing that weird thing. I don't know why.
hmm Well, I mean, anyhow, Lucy will be recording. Viva, you will be asking questions, interviewing. I'll just be like here supervising, and Ainor, you'll be answering and just having a conversation, I guess.
Okay.
So whenever all of you are ready and comfortable, y'all can just get started.
Okay. Well, obviously, first of all, thank you so much for coming. And I understand, like, I think you've seen the questions.
Yeah,
So,
Albert
yeah,
did give me a question.
perfect. So first off, I want to just do a little like disclosure that this is a fresh topic. Well, it's a hard to speak about topic. It's very fresh. It's very touchy. And thank you for obviously voicing your opinion and just like talking to us about it because it's hard to do it if obviously it's a hard topic to talk
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
okay, so if you don't mind, like we'll just start off with like a brief introduction of like you. Obviously, we already did names, but just for example, like like your origin, maybe
Mhm.
just to help.
Yeah. So my name is Ainor, and I am from Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm currently a senior in college. I'm 22 years old, and I'm studying political science and public policy at ASU in Arizona.
That's how are you finding the degree? Just a quick question.
It's really interesting. It's like a double major, so I think it's pretty interesting. So that's why this is kind of like my area of interest.
Hmm. Okay, so I mean, I think we'll now move on to the actual interview itself. Um, this is again another disclosure. This is trying to be as least biased and as least prejudiced as possible towards either side. So just phrasing that. Um, whom do you think has a more legitimate claim over the land in the Palestine Israeli conflict?
Yeah, so as far as all of my knowledge goes, and just given the history that I've learned so far, I think given that in order for the Israelis to take back the land that they claim was originally theirs, the fact that they had to displace like hundreds of thousands, almost a million people in the process doesn't necessarily justify their claims to the land. And given that the Palestinians have been there for generations and there are actually living people who remember their times in Palestine. People have lineages that go back hundreds of years to Palestine versus the people who cite and believe and claim that they have a claim to the land as a Jewish person. The farthest back that their lineage goes is like thousands of years, and no living person, or you can't go back just a few generations and a few hundred years of actual. Of most of the Israelis' families who actually live there, most of their like history in Israel is very fresh when Israel was created. And so I think just the impact on the Palestinian people and how many ties they actually had to it in the past few hundred years legitimizes their claim that they have a much bigger tie to it than a majority of the people who have moved to Israel, who are maybe from America or from New York or from Brooklyn, whose families have lived in America for hundreds of years, versus people who actually are from Palestine and have family that actually dates back to Palestine, rather than most Israelis whose origins come from Europe or come from America or come from other parts of the world. But most Palestinians, if their origins are not from Palestine, they're from the Middle East or they're Arab, or they at least have that ethnic like component. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, you mentioned displacement and a huge human rights aspect in the overall, not justification, but I guess answer to to the question. So I just want to know, like, or just have you explain a little bit what you think regarding the human rights violations that might be occurring, and obviously you mentioned that a lot of people are also unfortunately passing away, which is again another very touchy subject. But just to get a couple like words regarding which um, the well-being of both the people on both sides,
Mhm.
as well as the displacement, and what you really think the impact it's having as of right now.
Yeah, so of course, it isn't to say that like the lives lost on both sides aren't important, and that of course it's extremely sad, and no one is downplaying the fact that the loss of lives on either side is well, at least most people aren't downplaying that either side um deserves to die or deserves to live. Everyone is very um everyone very much acknowledges that no civilians deserve to die and that there shouldn't be this crossfire that affects civilians directly. But there is one side that is severely committing human rights violations, and that has done so for um, several decades. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that what happened on October 7th was very sad, and no one is saying that it wasn't, but it's really important to understand that um, once again, those things don't happen randomly. It was not random, and it was not without without actual action from the Israeli side. So of course the displacement happened 75 years ago. I don't know if you guys know, but given that this is your area of expertise, you probably know. But in the Nakba in 1948, when they created the state of Israel, they displaced almost 750,000 people, and I believe like almost like close to a million people had to leave as well. So I think given that they drove out like multiple families, multiple lineages, they basically have trapped 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, where the roads that they're not able to cross certain roads. They All of the places that they can work or what they can do is controlled. Like just every aspect of your life is policed by people that don't like you. And so when your entire life, when when you live in a place where you're alive but you're not living, there's only so much that you can do before you decide, hey, we need to do something to figure this out and to create a livable life for us. And so there is only so much that people can handle, that we as a people can handle before things happen and before um, we have to take dire actions. Not saying that killing anyone is ever justifiable, but I think until we're in that situation where we are barely living, we can't really begin to understand what people will do to be able to live and to create safe conditions for themselves and to just have to beg for equal rights and for to be treated like equals. So I think given that the situation that happened on October 7th was very sad, the retaliation is not proportional at all. And I think there's only so much that you can justify, and a lot of people have begun, after the death toll has reached like a very egregious number, a lot of people have realized that this is very disproportionate compared to what has happened. And a lot of more people are starting to realize that there's a lot more history to learn. And what happened on October 7th didn't just grow out of a vacuum. It wasn't just a random thing that happened. And there's been a lot leading up to this. And for the past few decades, a lot more Palestinian lives have been taken versus Israeli lives. And so it's been disproportionate for years. And now we're seeing an even growing number of a disproportionate response, in that 10 times more Palestinians have died just to avenge the lives of 1,000 people. They are showing that they have no consideration for 10,000 Palestinian lives. So I think it is very sad that they are allowed to bomb hospitals, bomb schools, that they're getting billions of dollars of funding, that just the majority of what they are doing is not being stopped. And whether people are speaking out or not, no one is actually trying to stop it, especially bigger governments like England, the UK, America, of course. I believe Canada as well. So it's very disheartening to see that everything that goes against international law is not being spoken about. It's not, no one is trying to do anything to stop it, whether we bring awareness to it or not. The people who have the power to stop it, they're just being complacent. So it's just really devastating to see that.
Okay, you mentioned a lot of things that I'm gonna ask you about later. Obviously, other countries' roles in this conflict, which we will touch upon, as well as propaganda and the media aspect. But I'd also like to primarily just ask you the question, because you said that the government was, well, there's roles, there's some governments, there's some higher powers that aren't doing what they're supposed to do to solve this conflict.
Mhm.
What would you do, or what would you think is a potential solution to this conflict? Because there's no clear solution as of right now. Well, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I definitely do agree that it's not a complex situation. There's a complex solution. So it's very clear cut what's happening to the Palestinian people, but the problem is after so much hate has brewed for decades, it's very difficult to now just ask a people to live peacefully among one another. Not to say that they wouldn't, but the outcome of it is very hard to predict. And so I think that's where it comes in, where the solution is difficult. I think the first thing is not sending billions of dollars to Israel. So one of the biggest things that's fueling this is the Israeli government's allies, because they are only condoning what they're doing, and they're only supporting them financially and with weapons and as much aid as they can funnel out. So I think the first step would be to not pick a side, because if we're picking a side, it's only fueling this sense of war that's brewing, where people who pick sides um are against other people who are on the other side. And so I think it's very hard now that we're picking sides, and more specifically saying we stand with this group of people. Um, and so we shouldn't be funding any kind of war on another people. So if we fund Israel's attack on Gaza or on the Palestinian people, we're only further supporting it. Now, if we provide humanitarian aid to the struggling people of Gaza, that's not picking a side. That is simply standing up for human rights. And I think that's the problem, is we're conflating it with a political aspect, and like politics, and helping Gaza or helping Palestine is somehow picking the Palestinian side, when realistically we should be doing what we can to help people who are being affected, and who are suffering from human rights violations. That's why we created the United Nations, and that's why their international law exists. So we specifically stop people who commit genocide, who commit human rights violations. So simply sending money to Gaza to aid it without, because it doesn't have food or water, electricity or fuel or any infrastructure left, or any hospitals, sending that kind of aid is not picking a side. It's just standing up for human rights. So I think that's where we have to make that differentiation, where when we send money to Israel, we're only funding their genocide of the Palestinian people, and we're only like supporting them in what they're doing and in their active tirade on the Palestinian people, versus when we send money to Palestine and we stand up for human rights, we are just helping them survive. We're helping them live, which shows that there are two completely different sides, that it's not a war, it's a genocide, when one side can barely even afford to live and survive, while the other side's population is hardly affected. So that's just what I think on that. I think it's a very complicated situation, but at least to begin with, we shouldn't be funding the invasion and the devastation of a people to begin with. That would very much help.
So I'd like to, this is just based off what you said, this is not a like determined question. This is just a general question. In the media, especially you can see it on TikTok, on Instagram, all over the media, it's there's two clear sides. There's Israel, there's Palestine. Would you say, so to speak, that there it really is no there's not it's not justifiable to say that there's two sides, it's for people more so, because obviously we've already talked about the human rights aspect of it. From just based on what you're saying, I'd just like to understand what you think based on that.
Yeah, I think that's the issue, is we start to conflate it with politics. And so of course Israel is its own state and it has the power, it's a government, and that has to do with, like, when you support Israel, it has to do with foreign relations and it actually has to do with politics. But when you are supporting Palestine and its right to be free, at the end of the day, it's just about human rights. This is a state that doesn't have a real army. Its people don't have real infrastructure. Almost, I believe, 50% of people in Gaza live in poverty. If one side has the ability, if Israel has the ability to turn off its food, its water, its fuel, if it has such a large impact on the livelihood of Palestine, those are people that are not free. They don't have their own they don't have any liberation or any right to self-determination. And so I think when we just think of it as this government who can make its own choices, or this state or this nation that can make its own choices, we are equating it with Israel when they are not the same. They are not both two independent states or nations that have governments, like that have functioning governments, that have functioning armies, that have their own right to freedom. They are not the same. There's very much one that is more powerful and more controlling of the other. And so I think it's very important that we focus on what's happening to the Palestinian people and understand that it's not just as simple as when two countries are fighting, because it's very much one is being oppressed by the other. So that's just my opinion on that.
Let's jump, like, if we could just jump back to, I think, your the question before and your response. I'd just like to ask you, regarding other governments, other countries, other global superpowers, you could say, as you mentioned, the USA. Um, do you think that in the conflict they have done what they should have done? The response is accurate, or has it been too little, too much, or what would you determine is maybe okay? There's certain countries maybe the response was better than others, but
Mhm.
in general, just overall, what would you say that they were doing less or more that
Yeah,
they should?
so I wish they were doing more of the right thing. So they are doing, in my opinion, too much of the wrong thing, like I talked about, which is like funding a lot of the weapons, especially in the US. I think we're maybe at $50 billion that we've sent to Israel by now. I think on two or three different occasions they've passed different resolutions. Um, and so, and then in comparison, they have given 100 million to Gaza. And I did the math on that, and there are 2.2 million people in Gaza, and you divide $100 million US dollars onto 2.2 million people, that's $50 a person. $50 a person does absolutely nothing, whether that's to buy them a few meals. That isn't going to do anything to rebuild any hospitals, to rebuild any homes. 1 million people have been displaced because they've either lost their homes, they've had to move from northern Gaza to southern Gaza. So when we look at the disproportionate response that the US is particular, because I think that's the one that I can speak to the most since I'm from here. Um, the disproportionate response in comparison to Israel versus Gaza is very astounding. And I think it requires a lot of self-reflection to really understand how can we say we don't support genocide and we don't support the killing of innocent Palestinians, and we give them maybe 1% of what we've given Israel, and then we go and turn around and give Israel the very weapons it needs to kill the Palestinian people. And Israel already receives billions of dollars from the US every single year. So it didn't need extra billions of dollars to fund this. It was only helping it get even worse and be able to have an even harsher response to the Palestinian people. So what I wish is that governments around the world would at least have the decency to look into what is actually happening. But the problem with a lot of these countries is that their pockets are just lined very heavily, especially people in Congress or people in politics. Um, all of this is about money. And we have had past history of our current president, Joe Biden. Has gotten on TV before in past years and said that that Israel is an investment for the United States, and that if they didn't have an Israel in the Middle East, they would have to create one. So he's gotten on TV and said that very clearly. And at the end of the day, they've made it, whether they like it or not, they've made it very clear that this is about financial interests for them. And they can get away with a lot in the Middle East if they have Israel on their side and if they can fund Israel, because it was funded by them, it was created by them, and it's now too late for them to try and work with other Middle Eastern countries. No Middle Eastern country is going to be really allies with any of these big superpowers. So at the end of the day, I think all they're doing is funding their own interests. And I wish they would actually look to the human rights and look to what the majority of the American population actually likes and cares for, and what's in their best interest. And if you look at the numbers and the surveys that people have done recently, majority of our voting population actually wants a ceasefire and supports um, the stopping of all killing on either side. So if government actually worked for the people like it's supposed to, if we were a real democracy, the government would do the right response. And just like most of these countries around the world pretend to serve their people, um, at the end of the day, if they were actually serving their people, we wouldn't be in this situation. So I just wish they would at least listen to um, what's actually right. So that's my thought on that.
Okay, now another just brief, not planned question.
Yeah.
Do you believe that a ceasefire would actually work? Because obviously you did mention some statistics about it, but the general consensus in different parts of the world is crazy different, and that's why I just want to get another person's interpretation on it.
Yeah, so I think a ceasefire would work in the sense that it was working previously. Like they weren't actively like the Palestinians and Israelis weren't actively in war at all times. Yes, there's always been tensions and there's always been killing on both sides, which isn't to say that that was a great state of affairs or that that was ideal, but who's to say if they stopped now that something randomly would happen? There was the Arab Israeli war back in the 70s, or I believe the 60s, and after that Israel got part of the land that was actually promised to the Palestinian people, and they were able to claim that land. But did any huge eruptions happen afterwards? Maybe not for a couple decades. There was a big issue back in 2014 where Gaza was also demolished again and had to be rebuilt back up. And there were a lot of issues and tensions back in 2014 as well. And then dies down for a little bit, goes back to its slightly tense state of affairs, but no active war and active back and forth killing. And then we have this other issue that has now happened this year. So it's not to say that if they stopped all of a sudden, or they asked for a ceasefire, that they wouldn't stop, or it would just cause like it would just give Hamas more time to go and kill Israelis again, because that hasn't happened previously. There has been where it dies down, and there are at least a less tense there are less tense conditions for a while. And so I think it would at least help to give some time for the international community to actually get involved and maybe figure out a solution for this once and for all. And I think that's the problem, is that every time some big eruption happens, it stops and we just let the state of affairs go back to how it was. And we don't ever genuinely get involved and figure out a solution, because once again, at the end of the day, realistically, most countries are benefiting from Israel's power and occupation of Palestine. And so a ceasefire only works if our politicians actually get involved and work as an international community to figure out a genuine solution, not call for a ceasefire and allow Palestinians to go back to being imprisoned and killed on a less regular basis, but still killed at a higher proportion than Israelis. So that's the only reason why a ceasefire alone can't work. It requires actual like action from the international community and on both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian side. So it is a little bit complicated to actually get that progress that we're looking for.
You mentioned the obviously the politicians and Joe Biden primarily. A while back, I think it was a couple weeks ago when the conflict actually started. Joe Biden put out multiple tweets, but the main one I want to focus on is jumps into my next question regarding propaganda in general. On Instagram, on Instagram, it's a lot of it's primarily it's on Instagram. It's where there you can see photos from both sides. Again, I want to put in parentheses because again we've already disclosed they're not really sides. You can see photos and posts supporting both sides and general propaganda, as well as Joe Biden's Twitter and tweets being very focused upon. And regarding the media and social media, like more specifically, obviously, do you believe that the variety of these posts and pictures are hurtful, or do they bring awareness? It's a really hard topic to discuss just due to like the tragedy behind all the photos being shared, despite of where they're located and what they show, as well as the fact that there's um, photos being shared of actual like people that have passed away, and it kind of is a very sensitive like gray area that it's hard to touch upon. So do you believe it's more hurtful or brings awareness?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what is being shared. So I think I have seen a lot of videos and I follow a lot of actual journalists from Gaza who post every day about what's happening and what, like when hospitals are bombed, schools are bombed, whatever it is, like dead bodies. I've seen a lot of things that I've never seen before. And while it is definitely just very new to us to see something like that, I think we have this advantage where we live in an age where social media exists. And this is one of those things that, one of those really terrible tragedies that we will probably hear about in history books. And that back then they didn't have social media or didn't have the ability to just post what was going on and what was happening to them. And we were able to actually see it in real time. We've never really heard about that. And so the impact that that has can be beneficial in a way that it's harder to lie and to actually disprove what they're saying just in a news article if you can actually watch videos of what's happening, if you can watch like real footage and real coverage of what's going on. It can advance their cause and it can advance like the truth of the articles that we read and the death toll and the stories that we read about that are actually happening, because this conflict is very rooted in propaganda in the sense that one side will try to deny the what's happening to the other side, and I will let everyone make their conclusions about which side is which. But there is one side in particular that is very great with their propaganda. They have an amazing propaganda machine funded by multiple countries around the world and funded by billions of dollars. And there is one side that you see their soldiers make TikToks and they dance and they laugh, and the other side has videos of people dying and people displaced, people having to leave their home, people, women who are pregnant who don't have a hospital to go to, who are having C-sections without anesthesia, who their babies are dying left and right, like they're having to do surgeries without anesthesia. And so you get to see, social media gives us that power to see which side is truly suffering, which side is actually being impacted by this. Not to say that there aren't people still suffering from what happened on October 7th, but which side continues to suffer every single day, whose families are dying out, lineages are dying. People can name upwards of 30 to 40 members of their family that are dying. And so when we actually get to see what's happening to these people, it only allows us to sympathize with them in a real way that makes us emotional and makes us feel like we can do something, like we need to do something. And if we don't feel that connection to them through the social media and through the posts that they are posting, we might not understand the gravity of the situation or the severity of what's happening. So it can be a lot more helpful when it's showing the truth, but when it's pushing and deflecting, it's pushing propaganda and deflecting away from what's really happening, that's when it can be harmful. um when it's when it's forcing you to focus on one specific aspect of what happened to one side in order to justify what's happening to the other side on a much graver scale, then it can be harmful. No one's saying there shouldn't be awareness as to what happened on October 7th or what happened to the hostages or what happened to the people who died. No one said that we need to forget anything about them, but we can't use them over and over and over as an excuse as to why Palestinians deserve to die or why what's happening right now is justified. That doesn't, you shouldn't kill one group of people and then say that, okay, well, this group of people is somewhat connected to the people who killed the people that we care about. So we're going to go and kill them in the 10 times more numbers than the people who originally died. So I think it's just very sad to see the way that people will weaponize social media, but it has been very impactful in getting people to actually sympathize with the cause and understand what's going on, and it mobilizes people in greater numbers. But it is very sad to see that people will use like AI and deep fakes, create fake videos, and do a lot more just to deflect from what's genuinely happening and the genuine genocide that's happening. So
Would you say that, again, based off, this is another just based off your response question. Um, would you say that a certain side is utilizing the propaganda more than the other? And if so, if the social media posts are, in your eyes, considered propaganda, as well as that, just an add-on question, which app would you have you seen or do you believe is the most used for said propaganda? And last part, I know it's like a three-part question, but would you say that certain apps are more biased towards others, towards one side than another? Like, because certain apps obviously are funded by certain governments and certain people, and would you say that that's affected the side that they take?
okay, yeah. So let me try to answer all three parts. So I would say that some apps are a lot more biased to one side versus the other. So I don't know the history or like the background of which app funds which government. So that's why I think my answer should be pretty unbiased, because this is just from my personal profiles that I see what happens. TikTok, I don't have very many issues with what shows up on my For You page. It is still very much in alignment with the things that I watch. So just like how it used to be before all of this happened, all my videos used to be very much in alignment with the things that I like and what I watch, and very usual algorithm for me. And I still do see that that happens now, where it's still showing up all of the things that I would like, and it's very much to the content that I would like. Meanwhile, on my Instagram, I used to get upwards of 100 to 150 views on my Instagram stories. And I had a post I think last night, that has been up for about 15 hours now, that has 27 views. 27 views. And no one knows what your story is on Instagram till they press on it. So that's why I have a little bit of a hard time believing that people like, oh, they know what I post, so they're just not watching it, because that's literally never happened to me before. And no one knows until they press on it what I actually am posting. So the fact that in the 10 years I've had Instagram, I have never once had that low of a story since Instagram stories have started. I've never had that low of a viewer count. Is just kind of showing me that there might be some censorship or some kind of issues going on with what whether I'm shadow banned or whether I'm not showing up at the front of people's stories anymore, and they're just kind of pushing me to the back, so people are less likely to get to my posts and less likely to see my stories. So that's just showing me a lot about which side is maybe not actually being unbiased or is actually taking a side on part of this. And then, sorry, remind me of the first two parts of your question.
I was just asking in regards to if you think that it can be considered propaganda, and if so, which governments are or which countries are using it more so primarily.
Okay, yeah. So, I would say that the Israeli government uses propaganda on a higher rate. So, Israel is funded by billions of dollars. Israel has a stable government. They have a stable army. They have the resources and the global support to push propaganda versus push real news. Palestinians are posting unedited live videos on the ground. There are three journalists at the head of what's going on in Palestine, and they are 22, 24, and I believe 23 or 22 years old. All three of them are in their mere 20s. They are not social media experts. They are not certified or specialized in propaganda. These are people who film their everyday lives and are telling you exactly what happened. They will take videos and they'll say a hospital was just bombed. Like we're running out of water, we're running out of fuel. This many people just died in front of me. This happened, this happened. They are filming just genuine live videos and posting them on a consistent basis just to inform people of what's going on. Meanwhile, I see TikToks on the Israeli side that are there was a video of an IDF soldier saying turning girl math into Hamas math, and they're filming, yeah, it's kind of funny, right? It's funny. Like that's insane. That is not something like there's no way that we have one side filming like their mom dying and like someone's leg blown off, and then we have a government and an army that's like, oh, Hamas math, like, or they're filming TikToks like they're dancing. Like it's just genuinely there is no other way to see the difference in the propaganda and the difference in who is pushing stories. And one side has insane celebrities on their sides, like that are pushing propaganda for them. The celebrities that support Palestine or that are posting things about Palestine are simply taking content from people on the ground in Gaza or on the ground in Palestine and posting it, and they're spreading the awareness, or they attend protests, or they're doing genuine things for the cause. Versus there are people who will post on the Israeli side or that support the Israeli government, and they make a lot of very hateful Islamophobic comments, or they are trying to equate and conflate Hamas with the Palestinian people in an effort to support what the Israelis are doing. And that's what's creating completely different responses on both sides. That's what's making people feel that what's happening to Palestine is justified, and that's why theirs is propaganda. It's harmful. It's pushing a narrative that's not true. It is making people believe things are a certain way when they're not. It's making people believe Israelis and Israel are fighting for freedom, are fighting for peace, are fighting against terrorism, and the constant use of certain words such as anti-Semitism, terrorism, Hamas, those are all equally used. The right to defend themselves, all of these things are used to push this narrative that Israel and what Israel's doing is justified. Meanwhile, all Palestinians want, they don't want the eradication of Jews. They don't want the eradication of Israel or the Israeli people. All they want is their own liberation. And to assume that maybe 15, 20, 30,000 Hamas militants represent the millions of Palestinian people is unjustified for you to say. And so one side is pushing the genocide of the other. Meanwhile, the other side is just calling and begging and praying for their freedom and for their human rights. So that's why one side is definitely more likely to be considered propaganda than the other.
Would you say that based on that, well, would you say that based on the fact that there is obviously a layer of propaganda in most social media apps, that it's more directed towards s- gaining supporters, gaining not government per se, but like more funding, as you mentioned, from other governments or citizens. So in the regardment, if like let's say that I'm not sure, I have no actual statistic on this, but let's say that um, more of some more citizens have access to social media than the others. Would you say that it's trying to gain the citizens' belief support as well
Mhm.
as just already existing supporters, or what would you say? To what degree and to which?
Yeah, so I think it is definitely trying to gain, like, the propaganda is aimed at gaining, whether it's support for the country or even just support for what they are doing. So, in the sense of like Israel, when they're using their propaganda and when they're pushing the propaganda that they are and pushing the narrative that they are, they just want the world to be silent, essentially. They don't even necessarily need the world to say, I support Israel and I stand with Israel. They just need people to not fight for Palestine. They are trying to show what we are doing is justified because, like we know and like we've seen in history, um not having a side, not taking a stance, not fighting for the oppressed is being on the oppressor's side. So whether you actually support Israel or you're just silent and don't want to take a stance at all, you're supporting Israel. The way that Israel wants to portray the situation is they want to make it appear complex. They want everyone to think that this is a multifaceted, deeply complex, very rooted issue that you don't know enough about. Their goal, especially Americans who don't know anything about anything, we are very much ignorant, and anything that has to do with the world around us, we don't very much look into it. Even things that happen in our own country, we don't look into stuff. We don't research. If it doesn't affect us in our everyday lives and we can't feel the effects of it, we don't care. And so what the Israeli government wants to do with their propaganda and what they're trying to push is for you to think that this issue is complex, and for you to feel so confused as to who you should support and what you should support, and to make you think that you hate Jews if you support Palestine, or that you're anti-Semitic if you support Palestine. They want you to think that way because then you'll be quiet. Then you won't stand up for Palestine. Then you won't stand up against Israel, and you're not going to fight them in what they're doing to the Palestinian people. And by doing that, by being silent, by not saying anything, you're supporting Israel. You are helping Israel do what they want to do because you're not going against them. Would Israel be able to do as much as it can if they had millions of people protesting? They have millions of people not supporting the funding for them, millions of people urging their Congress people and their representatives and their politicians not to support Israel. Would Israel be as successful if they had all of these people against them, all of these opponents? They wouldn't. So that's why they want people to either support them, or they want people to feel confused and be silent and feel, well, I don't know much and I don't want anyone to think I'm anti Semitic or that I hate Jews or that I don't care about the lives of innocent Israelis or whatever it is, that you don't want anyone to look bad upon you, or I don't want to lose my job because people have been losing their jobs here if they stand for a specific side. And the Israeli propaganda machine is doing that because so many people who support Israel are very highly successful, very wealthy people, and they have a lot of influence in a lot of places. People lose their jobs, or they're unable to, or they end up on a website called Canary Mission, which is a website where they put anti Semites and they put Nazis and they put a bunch of people on there. And they are painting people who support Palestine as anti Semites and terrorists. and you can lose your job or you can never gain a job in any industry if you're on that website. And there are people who look at that website and actually decide whether they will hire someone based on whether they're on that website or not. So that propaganda machine has grown so large, and its intentions are either to silence you into complacency or to gain your support, whichever one works out the best for them. But as long as you're not against them, they can do whatever they want. So that's that.
The entire world is you're right on the fact that the entire world is getting affected by this propaganda and this large propaganda machine. I'd like to just quickly bring up one thing that I don't know if you're aware of. In Spain, at least, there's been, I think, every Saturday there's protests of Israeli versus Palestine. Again, I the sides thing is very hard to say in a question, but there's uh, protests from both sides. They shut down the streets. It's very big in Spain. I'd just like to hear if there's any protests or actual uh, actions or present effects in your life that, because obviously you said Arizona, so America, so again, different continent.
Yeah.
So we just like just to hear a bit of your perspective. Is it having a effect in your day-to-day life as well, like not just mentally, not just on Instagram, not just on your phone, but actually talking and being with other people and maybe in protests? I'm not 100% sure if there's is protests, but it's part of the question.
Yeah, so they're actually, so I think that's what's sad about it too, is like I don't feel an impact in my everyday life. Not a lot of people around me talk about it. Like only the people like my family, because I'm Egyptian, so I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Arab, so the Palestinian struggle is very much important to my background and to my family and everything. So my family talks about it, but I don't really have a lot of people in my everyday life that talk about it or that are affected by it or that are concerned by it, except for my family and like my boyfriend. And that's about it. So I think that's what's showing that this is making people feel like paralyzed in the sense that they don't know what to do or they don't know who to support or they don't want to take a side or anything. So I don't feel like my day-to-day life has even really been disrupted. But something that's really that I have seen is that there are protests. So there is actually a protest happening today, like about 10 miles or so from my house. So it's very close by. It's just not like in the everyday sense, like a street's getting shut down like every day or every week or something. Like you can still go about your life and not even feel it. If you never went on social media, you would never know and you would never feel it because not enough people talk about it or think it has anything to do with them or think that it matters. So that is another reason why I say that this thing has pushed people just into silence, into complacency, because they think I don't know anything. I'm not going to say anything about this. So not enough people talk about it. But there was just a protest in Washington D.C., which is our capital. There was one in I think like a couple weeks ago. It was the largest one in US history, I believe, relating to Palestine. So it was the largest Palestinian protest in US history. It was about 300,000 people. People traveled from different states, from all around the country just to attend the protest because that's where the White House is, that's where Congress is, and that's where all of our politicians are. So that's why it was really important to everyone to be there. So there are protests all around. There's in Chicago, Illinois. There's a bunch of protests happening in support of Palestine and on college campuses. And that is why this is actually affecting college students the most. A lot of student organizations like I think it's Students for Justice in Palestine. That's like that's an organization that has multiple chapters on college campuses across the U.S. And Jewish Voice for Peace. Both of those organizations have been working very heavily together on different campuses to do protesting and a lot of things. They actually just got suspended at Columbia University for a walkout that they did. So it's still actively happening, and the like push against Palestinian protest is still very much going on, is still very active. So I think when you actually go on social media and you talk to people that's when I feel it, but it is still very much you can go about your regular day and not feel affected by it at all if you were to never go on social media.
Okay, so based on that, would you like to just wrap up your ideas just in a not in a sentence, like in a couple sentences, maybe, if you'd like to? I don't know if you'd like to.
Yeah, so I think just all in all, it's very disheartening to see what's happening in the sense that people think that history starts when they start paying attention. They think that history begins now that they started to pay attention and understand it. So many people didn't even know what was going on in Israel and Palestine before. They had never heard about the conflict. They've never cared to learn about the history. And so I think if we continue to think that things that we're uneducated about or things that we know nothing about or that have nothing to do with us are things that we shouldn't be concerned with or things that we shouldn't become educated about, that can be so harmful. And we can already see the effects now when we're complacent and when we're not doing enough to advocate for people, for other people, whether it's here in our own countries or people around the world. um, it's going to create this very desensitized society where people think that they only need to be concerned or worried about what happens to them. And I just really urge people to get educated, to actually understand what's going on, and to not fall into this trap of thinking that if you support Palestine or if you're against the genocide of Palestinian people, that you somehow hate Jews, that you somehow hate Israelis as a people, as a whole, that you are somehow anti Semitic, that you support terrorism. All of these things that are being pushed onto people who speak out about against Palestine are the reason that people feel afraid and they don't want to say anything. So I really just want people to let go of those shackles that are holding them down and to just get educated about what's happening and make their own independent decisions. Don't let propaganda or influence from either side affect you or influence you. Just do your research, check the facts, understand what's actually going on, and look at the textbook definitions. Understand what genocide actually means, understand colonialism, understand occupation, understand what do these terms that we've learned about for years in school actually mean, and tell me what you genuinely think when you put those words into perspective and apply those words to the Palestinian Israeli situation. What can we call that? And that's really the best thing I have to say.
Well, thank you again. This has been very informative, and I very much so like to see someone that's in a different place entirely, what their perspective is on it, as well as that. Obviously, your time. Thank you, and also, again, I know this is a very sensitive subject, and you said you have family or some a connection to it. So obviously, I'd like to thank you for being able to talk about it with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys for doing this. I really do appreciate it. I love that you guys are getting youth involved and actually working to have these difficult conversations. So, really excited to see everything you guys do about this topic.
Thank you so much again.
Of course.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
guys.
Ainor,
Have
for
a good one.
joining.
Have a good one.
You too.